I want to thank you all, really sincerely, including our guest speakers, for turning out tonight and to warmly welcome you to this evening's event, which was conceived as a response to a previous event held in this same church 3 months ago to the day, but also as a response to the large banners, posts, emails and petitions, etc., that many of us have seen recently. It was chatting to my friends and neighbours on my street who happened to be members of Sustainable Woodstock and who also attended the Stop Botley West event that we found that we wanted to address the imbalance created by what we saw as essentially a very negative campaign. And we were all disturbed by how there was too little time for us to ask the questions that we had wanted to ask. So this evening's event seeks to be a more participative forum and has been designed to balance out the debate and offer a chance for a more open public discussion that acknowledges, and we hope, is more concerned about facing into the challenges of climate change now and into the future decades. It is so easy, I think, to feel powerless in the face of unprecedented change and the unknown aspects of a hard-to-imagine future. And it is so difficult to confront the thorny issues of climate change that we'd all rather ignore. Coming together like this helps. So really, thank you all for coming to listen to our panel tonight. We hope that during the evening, questions and views will emerge that can be expressed and shared here freely tonight. In my present role as the editor of your local community magazine, I believe in holding space for the conversations that we need to have in order to avoid the extremes of polarisation that we sadly too often see these days. I believe in endeavouring to allow a balance of different views so that things can be considered thoughtfully in a safe space, safe relative to the wild west of social media platforms. This event is held as an extension of that belief, and we do ask participants to act accordingly here in this church and to speak to each other kindly and with respect for the fact that we human beings are all different and we're all entitled to have evolved different views. We also need you to know that this event is being recorded and will then be shared via the Sustainable Woodstock website at some point in the future for people unable to attend who did request this. The video recording will be focused on the panel, but audio will be recorded of any questions or comments that come from the floor. So if anyone does have concerns about this, please inform one of the volunteers or sign up on the pad that you will find at the back of the church before you leave. Our plan for this evening is that each speaker will speak for up to 10 minutes, which will take us up to about the first 50 minutes. And then, excuse me, and then during the following hour, we very much hope to hear from you and to set in motion, excuse me, an open conversation. And there will be roving mics that will go to where you are. We will then end promptly at 9. So I will now hand over to our chair, Paul Carter, a Methodist minister on the Oxford circuit, who has kindly agreed to chair this evening's event. So thank you, Paul. I hand over to you now.
Thank you, Sian. Can I add my voice to Sian's welcome? As Sian said, I'm a Methodist minister locally, and among the churches where I work are churches here in Woodstock, in Bladon, in Kidlington and in Tackley. But I'm here as a neutral person. I'm not a member of Sustainable Woodstock. I don't have irons in the fire in that kind of way, if you like. And I will endeavour to keep us to time and enable good conversation as best we can and enable as many people to speak as best we can. So as Sian said, speakers have up to 10 minutes each for a presentation at the beginning, and then we will open up the conversation more widely. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Sir Jonathon Porritt, CBE, environmental campaigner, author, and sustainable development expert. Jonathon, the floor is yours.
And delighted to be here this evening. It is really good to see so many people attending an event of this sort, given the enormous significance of what we're actually talking about tonight. One of the problems, of course, with something as big as climate change is making the connection between the local, in this case the very local, to this vast, huge challenge to our way of life today for every single human being on this planet. And this is often referred to in rather apocalyptic terms as something of an existential threat to the future of humankind. Now, to be honest, we're not short of existential threats right now. I woke up reading the Guardian this morning to be told by our Prime Minister that artificial intelligence, AI, could pose an existential threat to the future of humankind. We've lived for a long time with the potential existential threat that comes from the prospect of nuclear war. And of course, some of the geopolitical problems that we're up against at the moment have heightened that. But when it comes to climate change, scientists have actually been really nervous about using the concept of an existential challenge. And that's because they've been really applied to not overstating what the science has been telling us for the last 20, 30, 40 years, and making sure that people accept the credibility of their contribution to this debate. 2023 has changed all that. And what you will find as we head towards the end of this year is a large number of scientists who've been quite cautious and modest in the way in which they've talked about accelerating climate change, now beginning to talk with a very different tone, in a very different voice. There's an American climatologist called Zeke Hausfather, wonderfully memorable name, who's been one of those who's been very conservative in his use of language. But 2 weeks ago, he wrote a blog in which he said that the changes that we have witnessed in 2023 are gobsmackingly bananas. Not a normal bit of terminology for a highly reputable climate scientist, but you can see scientists today struggling to find the words to get politicians, and indeed ordinary citizens, to understand the nature of the crisis that we are up against today. We're not this evening going to explore all the ins and outs of what that science tells us, and I'm sure that many of you do pick up indications of just how bad that is from time to time, whether we're looking at global average ocean temperatures, which are now off the scale of anything that marine scientists thought possible, or the accelerated melting of the sea ice in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. But now we begin to understand these are all interlocking phenomena in an extraordinary process of change going on across every single part of the planet. And that affects every single one of us. It is difficult to understand why the politicians don't quite get this, especially as the financial implications of this are now looming pretty large. So here I offer you something from 2 weeks ago, Lloyd's of London, which you might consider to be at the heart of the establishment, the financial services sector establishment, brought out a report saying that we should anticipate extreme weather losses in the range of $5 trillion of economic losses over 5 years. You did not mishear that. That is not 5 billion. That is $5 trillion of potential damage from accelerating climate change. From what I can tell, not one single politician thought it was even commenting on a report of that significance. So the economic, financial implications of what is happening now in the physical changes going on in the planet are at a completely unprecedented scale. We may see terrible wars inflicting terrible damage, as we know, on millions of people. But the scale of damage that comes from climate change is in a different league. So, when, Sian, you talked about powerlessness and about the realization in many of us that we as individual citizens are struggling to find our point of contact with something as vast as that, trillions of dollars of economic damage, untold impacts on the lives of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people over the course of the next few decades. Yes, it is really difficult to find the point of contact. And that's what we're doing tonight. We are connecting that extraordinary story that has unfolded in our lives with what we can do as citizens in the places where we live to make as much of a difference as we can in those places. The backdrop is not good news. We have had decades of delay caused by all sorts of different factors that I obviously won't go into this evening. But now, at long last, more and more people are waking up to the reality of what is happening, the need to move urgently to address it, and the extraordinary array of solutions available to us to do exactly that. Yes, the politicians are difficult. It's often 2 steps forward and 1, or sometimes with certain governments, even 3 steps back. It's not very helpful. But they do get it. And some of the targets are beginning to make a real impact. So don't forget, despite the fact we've had some real difficulty here in the UK with a government that has decided to turn climate change into a wedge issue for the next election, don't forget that government is still committed to a target of a 100% renewable electricity system by 2035. A 100% decarbonised electricity system by 2035. That's a real target. That is formidably ambitious. To achieve that target means that we have to seize hold of every single opportunity that we can, particularly those that come along with the prospect of a really big contribution to meeting that otherwise very difficult target. In that portfolio of solutions, solar plays an enormously important part. A recent report from the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, based, of course, in Oxford, brought out a fascinating report saying that if the UK really wanted to do this, we could provide for 100% of our total energy needs, not just electricity, but total energy needs from solar and wind alone by 2050. The potential for this technology is remarkable. It improves all the time. Every year we see improvements in efficiency, and most years we see reduction in costs. So we are beginning to get our heads around the utterly formidable power of solar technology. And many people today don't understand this, but we are right now living through the very earliest stages of a solar revolution. And that's just as much the case here in Oxfordshire as it is in the UK as a whole, and it's a phenomenal global story unfolding everywhere. China, India, Southeast Asia. I've just come back from Indonesia where they're talking about a totally different approach to solar power in that part of the world. Australia, which has now got a government that actually believes that future Australia is all about solar and wind, not about coal, and everywhere, literally everywhere in the world, we begin to see solar playing an ever greater part in this story. We'll hear more. Right. Just got 1 minute to go. Yes, I've got my little stopwatch here. It's okay. So we do have to be clear about this. I mentioned the delay. Every business as usual year that we go through now is a year that we will not be forgiven for, particularly by young people who may feel generous about the wasted decades for which our generations have been responsible, but will absolutely not be generous if we continue to waste time as we have done for all of those decades. And that is the kind of scrutiny that we need to understand we are all under this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Professor Nick Eyre, who is Professor of Energy and Climate Policy in the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Nick.
Thank you, Paul. There's nothing wrong with being the second speaker at an event, but when you hear that you're the second speaker and the first speaker is going to be Jonathon Porritt, it just makes me think. I don't have Jonathan's powers of oratory, and fortunately that's not my role in the meeting today. It's to try to set a bit of the context for the debate that's going on in this town and the surrounding area in the county. Can I have the next slide, please, Graham? Thanks. So Jonathan set the context and mentioned that, despite some changes which many of us are a little unhappy about over the past few weeks and years, the UK remains committed under both the international, under the Paris Agreement, and under our own Domestic Climate Change Act to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And that is a massive change, and I'll say what it means locally in a few minutes. It means decarbonising our electricity system, but it also, as Jonathan said, it means decarbonising buildings, it means decarbonising heating, it means decarbonising transport, it means decarbonising industry, and to some extent decarbonising agriculture, and a further speaker may want to say a bit more about the last of those. Electricity is going to be absolutely critical because it's the easiest way to decarbonise energy, but then using low-carbon electricity is going to be critical in decarbonising heating, in decarbonising industry, in decarbonising transport. So that's why the 2035 zero-carbon electricity target is well before the 2050 zero-carbon date for the whole economy, all carefully thought through by the Climate Change Committee and its advisors. So that's the overall context in the country. We need to change the way we do lots of things, but starting with the energy system and electricity. So moving on to Oxfordshire. Next slide, please, Graham. I'm not going to try and sum up this 100-page report on pathways to a zero-carbon Oxfordshire in the few minutes that I've got. I just want to recognise that I think it has played an important role. It's a report I was involved in, led by my colleague Sam Hampton, but you can see the other authors there, a fantastic group of people who put a lot of work into this. And the list of funders is also, I think, important. All the district councils in Oxfordshire, the county council, the local economic partnership, the low carbon hub, Scottish and Southern, the local electricity network company. It, I think, shows the recognition amongst people who are responsible for public policy and the energy system that we do need sensible and serious analysis, but that change will have to come. So I'm really going to pick out two slides from that whole report to talk about. The first one is the next one, please, Graham. We looked at a number of different ways that Oxfordshire could get to its net zero in 2050 target. Oxfordshire has adopted the target that mirrors the UK government. And of course there are differences. In some cases there's more of a technological push, in others there's more social change. There are different ways you can reach net zero in the county. But there's some important common themes. We are going to have to, for example, do a lot of building retrofit. We are going to have to phase out gas boilers. We are going to have to make sure that our new homes are built to a decent standard, which then they haven't been historically. We're going to have to shift to lower impact transport modes. I was delighted to use my first ever concessionary bus fare to get here this evening. We are going to have to electrify the rest of transportation. And of course that means electricity use is going to increase, even as overall energy use falls. As we displace gas and oil, electricity use is going to rise, and that's going to need grid reinforcement and using electricity more flexibly. And there's lots of work going on in this county on those issues. And then outside the energy system, we are going to have to think about food systems, and we are going to have to protect ecosystems, and I think Jonathon may want to say more about those in his contribution. I didn't miss out the top one on purpose. It's because I want to get to it now. There is a huge amount of deployment of solar energy in all the pathways that we looked at to get to net zero in Oxfordshire, and that's largely because solar is not only the cheapest way of making electricity amongst the low carbon sources in Oxfordshire. It's cheaper than wind because we're not a very windy county. But it's the cheapest source of making electricity, full stop, in Oxfordshire. So the old discussion about, well, do we have expensive renewables or cheap fossil fuels, no longer valid. Wasn't even valid before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Certainly isn't valid now. There is the economic imperative and the environmental imperative are coming together on this. So next slide, please. You can read the quote there from the report. That top paragraph is taken directly from the Zero Carbon Oxfordshire report, Pathways to Zero Carbon Oxfordshire report. What does it say? It basically says we're going to need a lot of solar, and we're going to need to build it faster than we have done historically. This was written in 2021, before the proposal that has led to this meeting was on the table. So let me make that clear. In that the more ambitious scenario for Oxfordshire, which the County Council certainly wishes to pursue, we will need to increase solar deployment from 400 gigawatt hours a year to 3,900 gigawatt hours a year. Gigawatt hours a year, I'm aware, probably don't mean, it means a lot to me, but probably doesn't mean a huge amount to most people here. Let's just say we've got to have a factor of 10 increase in solar in the county. Nowhere in the report did we say where that was going to happen. We did say when it was going to happen, and we're going to need something like 800 to 1,000 gigawatt hours a year by 2030. It so happens that is about the output that would be expected from the Botley West solar farm if it was built. If we can get that amount by 2050, it provides 40% of Oxfordshire's energy. Again, energy, not just current electricity. So it's very significant. I just wanted to end because, as I said, the context of the report I wrote that I've been talking about there wasn't about Botley West, but just to go to the next and last slide, please, Graham. I think this is what a lot of people are asking, how big is Botley West? And so I thought I'd sit down and think about it myself and see how to describe it. If you look at, and there's three bubbles on that diagram. The inner one is Botley West. The yellow one is what Oxfordshire might need to do by 2050. And the big green one is what the UK might need to do by 2050. So is Botley West big? Well, it's certainly big by the standards of current solar farms. That's absolutely clear. It's about a fifth of the solar energy that we think Oxfordshire will need by 2050, so a very significant contribution. It's a very small fraction of what the overall country will need to deliver by 2050. We will need something like 200 times Botley West. Now that sounds enormous. Botley West itself is about 8 square kilometres, the proposal I think, which is about a fifth the size of Oxford City, but only 0.3% of the land area of Oxfordshire. So you can look at it in many different ways, depending which end of the telescope you're looking at it from. That's my point. Why here? You'd better really ask electrical engineers that, but the short story, which I think many people in this room will know, is that Botley West can be connected directly to the transmission grid. Indeed, Botley West will be the name of is named after the point of connection. That's to the 400 kilovolt national grid system. Smaller wind farms tend to be connected to lower voltage systems, typically the 33,000 volt system, not run by National Grid, run by our local distribution company, Scottish and Southern Energy Networks, and they currently have a very long delay, like most other distribution companies, in connection to the in wind and solar farm connections.
If you draw it to a close, please.
Yeah. So I'm just going to end by saying that undoubtedly will be ecological and agricultural impacts. I'm not going to talk about those because I'm relying on Jonathon to do that. But the land area required we're talking about, even for that big green blob, is of the order of 1% of the area of the country. You can think of that as a lot, or you can think of it as it's the amount of land we currently use for golf courses. So, well, which matters more?
Our third speaker this evening is Dr. Jonathon Scurlock, who is the Chief Advisor for Energy and Climate Change to the National Farmers Union.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, everybody. So, I'm a climate scientist, really, working for the National Farmers Union. I was taken on because of the impact of climate change on agriculture, and because potentially, and well, we're already seeing some realisation of that potential, farmers can do a lot to help enable clean electricity supply and the supply of various other forms of low carbon energy and other ecosystem services, while not necessarily compromising the very important role in food production. So, my first picture there, I'm going to show you a lot of pictures basically to try and provoke a little bit of debate. So fewer words, more pictures. We have already seen some experiments with can you actually do farming up and down in between the rows in solar farms. There's certainly fairly high standards that we've already managed to establish with the solar industry in terms of managing the land around solar farms for biodiversity, wildflowers, habitat for birds and pollinating insects and the rest of it. Does this clicker click or should I? No. All right, so next slide, please. So look, but the first thing obviously is that, one statistic, more than 2/3 of solar capacity in this country is actually in the hands of farmers, either hosted on farmland or on farm roofs like this. So variety of different sizes of system there, variety of different things. The one on the top left actually, that's Michael Eavis in the Glastonbury Festival host. That's his moo-tell where he puts the cows when the public are on his land. Top right is a poultry farm with 300 kilowatts. Bottom left there is a machinery shed, so fairly standard agricultural buildings now can just be built with, deliberately facing south and, ideally suited to provide an appropriate amount of power for use mostly on the farm itself. And then a large grain storage facility there in the bottom right. Now, all of this stuff, if it's under a megawatt, is permitted development. They don't have to get full planning permission for this. The really interesting thing that the government is starting to do now is to create more permitted development rights, one of which we believe will be solar canopies. So coming to a Tesco supermarket near you, or an industrial estate, or indeed, we sincerely hope, in farmyards, farmers are going to be able to put up things like large carports, overhard standing, where they park their agricultural machinery, and those will perhaps enable further electrification of the agricultural sector. Next slide. So, but solar farms. Now, that is a real solar farm. I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, those are not Photoshop sheep. This was taken out of the window of a farmer's Land Rover. It's actually quite an old one from about 7 or 8 years ago near Haverfordwest, and we were just literally bumping around the edge of the field in the farmer's Land Rover, and I took that picture out of the window. So it's a relatively large one, but the nice thing about that picture is that what it demonstrates, multifunctional land use, a relatively high standard of implementation. So solar panels are in there clearly generating a good ground rent for the farmer and energy for the local grid. But the installation was very neat and tidy. There were no dangling wires, so it was perfectly safe to put sheep in there, and the sheep certainly find plenty of forage both under the panels and in the areas around the edge. You will also notice the retention of hedgerows and fencing and so on, because this is a very large solar farm spread over about 7 fields. So all of those features can be there, food, energy and environment, from one land parcel. And this is, I think, the standard that has to be maintained if we are then going to be deploying out to these much larger levels. So the government has a target, 70,000 megawatts, 70 gigawatts of solar power by 2035. The industry itself, Solar Energy UK is the trade body, has said we should be looking at 40,000 megawatts by the end of this decade. Today we've got about 15,000 megawatts across roofs of all kinds, and then that includes about 9,000 megawatts of these solar farms at the present time. So as we go bigger, and this is a very scalable technology, we have to hold this industry to high standards, but it looks like it is possible to do it, even here in chattering classes Britain, where, yes, everybody wants to have a good old gossip about it, and we certainly don't want the sort of solar farms that we've seen in some other countries where maybe they weed kill under the panels and they put barbed wire fences and so on around. No, we want these things to be good neighbours. We want them to be part of the landscape, frankly, a modern agricultural landscape. So, next slide. So, we've nevertheless been challenged. This is our Deputy President, Tom Bradshaw. So agriculture has been a challenge at national level. You know, what is your position on solar farms? Aren't they bad for food security? Well, no. What we see is that renewable energy production, as I said earlier, is a very good diversification income opportunity for farmers. Certainly when it's put on roofs, when it's going on the land, well, our general preference is pretty much in line with government's planning advice, which is that it should preferentially go on to poorer quality agricultural land. And so there's a message there to the developers: don't pinch the best quality land, go out and do surveys, look on the maps and so on, select fields which are of lower grade wherever possible. Now, this is not going to be possible in the middle of Lincolnshire, where all of the land is good, and frankly, we believe Lincolnshire farmers probably also have a right to get involved with solar projects. But in general, yes, we need to spare the better land for more flexible agricultural production, but certainly there is space. Nationally, we're talking at the moment about less than 0.1% of all utilised agricultural area, about 18,000 hectares out of 18 million hectares of agricultural land in the UK. And if we multiply that by 4 or 5 times, if the government's ambitions are going to be met, we're still looking at about 0.5% of total land area, compared with quite a lot of other things that we do with our land, like, yes, playing golf. So that's our position. Utilising roofs and solar farm buildings, clearly we want to see the government incentivise that as much as possible, but we're pretty open-minded in terms of seeing solar farms developed. Next slide. Now, this is a really interesting potential opportunity, truly multi-purpose use of land. The emerging technology of agrivoltaics, these are how solar panels are made these days. They are actually two-sided, bifacial. So it is possible. This is fairly experimental. This is in Germany, but it looks like it's possible to arrange them in fences like this. If you put the fences sufficiently far apart, maybe about 10 metres, then there's all sorts of agricultural possibilities using quite large machinery in the spaces up and down in between. I can assure you, though, that there's nothing like this in the UK at the present time. DEFRA, the government ministry responsible for agriculture, is really rather interested in the potential of this. it remains to be seen whether the business model stacks up. But certainly, the farmer can continue getting more utility out of the land, clearly, rather than comparing that with a conventional sort of south-facing solar array. I think that is my last slide. One further. Just to say that, we have, as I said, tried to hold the solar industry to high standards, and we've certainly done a lot of work for the last 10 years with the solar industry trade body, Solar Energy UK. And, quite a lot of publications have come out documenting what good practice looks like. Clearly, everything of whatever scale, including perhaps here, must be done to this kind of high standard. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker this evening is Skye Frewin, who is the Marketing and Communications Coordinator from the Low Carbon Hub. Skye.
Thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you to the previous speakers. It's been really fascinating to have a refresher on all this really important information. When I was thinking about how I was going to start this meeting, I had a very different idea. But then a couple of days ago, I had a phone call from one of my childhood friends, and she told me the good news that she's pregnant. And I was absolutely filled with joy, and then when that subsided, just the fear hit me, worried about her child and how they're going to be living in the future. I'm certainly going to be experiencing the impacts, but thinking about how those close to me are going to as well. I should have said that at the end before I start crying. So I'd just like to say that throughout this talk and the discussions that we're going to be having, I'd really like us to bear in mind the urgency of the climate and ecological crisis. I want us to realise how it really compels us to exist in these uncomfortable spaces, and it demands action from us. So as we navigate this conversation, I encourage you all to be really brave in the face of this crisis. So you've all been sat down for a while, and just want to make sure everyone's still awake. So I just want to begin very quickly with a quick exercise. You just have to raise your hand if this applies to you. So if you've ever experienced any of these emotions when contemplating the climate crisis, if you could just raise your hand. So raise your hand if you've experienced anger. Raise your hand, or keep it raised, if you experience despair. Raise your hand if you've experienced fear. Raise your hand if you've experienced guilt. And raise your hand if you've experienced apathy. Okay, it's interesting. It's good to see where everyone's coming from. And for those of you that did raise your hand, just goes to show you that you're not the only one feeling this. Sometimes it can feel like a really isolating experience dealing with climate change. So yeah, other people are feeling it, and I certainly do. So next slide, please. So I'm going to start off with the why now of this discussion. And this is talking about the climate crisis because we can't make any decisions about the clean energy we're going to have without putting it into the context and considering the alternative. So when I look at the world, I've got to be honest and say that it is truly terrifying. Just today, actually, a major new report from the UN came out and found that the world is not only approaching a series of climate risk tipping points, but it's also on the brink of irreversible changes to nature, water systems, such as the drying up of groundwater, which is vital for our food supplies, and also pollution as well. As we've heard tonight, to achieve net zero by 2050, we must build rapidly the low-carbon electrical infrastructure, tackling climate change and enabling that we have energy security going forward as well. So next slide, please. So I just want to talk about mindset when we think about climate change. So maybe some of these are the things that you think of, thinking about climate change. We'll think of it in terms of the distant, maybe the unknown, not our responsibility, it's happening halfway across the world. But the climate crisis is no longer a distant issue. It's knocking at our door, and in a lot of places it's already bust the lock, if you will. Next slide, please. So this next slide is talking more about a UK focus, because I think it's better to relate to where we are. We're already seeing the consequences in the UK through heavier rain leading to flooding, hotter weather, pollution in the air, threats to wildlife, and challenges to our healthcare system. So we now know that it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. Next slide, please. So it's a lot of scary stuff I've been talking about, and this has a massive impact on the mental health of young people. I'm 24, and over 70% of young people feel hopeless in the face of the climate crisis. The rise of eco-anxiety doesn't necessarily stem exclusively from the enormity and the complexity of this challenge that we face, but it's also about the action. It's also the perceived inaction that generations before us have or haven't taken. Action needs to be transformational, and when we don't see that happening, it's quite despairing, and it's tokenism. There's no hope in tokenism. So where can we find hope? Next slide, please. This is me at a community-owned solar farm. This is Ray Valley Solar, owned by Low Carbon Hub. And we'll be talking a bit more later about community benefit and how it can really benefit communities. And next slide, please. So the thing that brings me hope is the fact that I've seen people change their mindset. I've seen people, see the climate crisis and realize that actually, future generations are going to be really impacted. And one of the tools that I've used is changing the way we think about timescales. So what we do this decade on climate change will resonate for thousands of years. And I want to challenge you to say, what would happen if we adopted a frame of reference which included the unborn generations of tomorrow? And let's kind of imagine how this decision-making around clean energy would be if we considered how it affected descendants 7 generations going forward. This is a way that some Native American cultures think about the future. We currently use the future as a catch-all for all of our ecological damage and technological risk, as if there was nobody in there. But there's this great silent majority of future generations who are powerless when we use that equation. And next slide, please. So we need to imagine something better. And when I think about the future, I try and think about the what if. So what if we could live in a world where clean energy is seamlessly integrated into our lives, where we can breathe fresh air, our energy comes from the sun and the wind, and these projects restore our green spaces. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about the why here. So we really need ambition with the challenges that we've been hearing about today. Clean energy is an imperative to creating a livable world in the future, and we'll need a whole lot more if we are serious about avoiding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So renewable energy has a key role to play in this zero carbon future, and especially in Oxfordshire, as we've heard, the technical capacity for solar is very high, and there's very little for any other form of renewable energy. So meeting our local and our national targets suggests that we need to optimise our use of solar in the county. And Oxfordshire is just one of many communities to play a part, and I hope that everyone feels that they can step up to that challenge. Next slide, please. So if ground mount solar is going to have an inevitable part in the renewable mix of this county, then we need to ensure that these installations are designed, implemented and managed in a way that benefits the local community and the environment. So I want to talk to you about community benefit. Next slide, please. So rather than asking who is doing enough, we should be asking how can we challenge ourselves to really get involved and take ownership of these installations. How can we do ground mount solar, if that is what we need to be doing in this county, the right way? We need citizen participation to address the needs of local communities and to build support. Some successful community-driven projects in Oxfordshire. I'd like to go on and talk about them now. Next slide, please. So we have, I'll start off with Low Carbon Hub because that's the group that I know about working for. So at Low Carbon Hub, we have solar, ground mount solar, Ray Valley Solar, we have rooftop solar, and we have a hydro project, which you can see there in the top right-hand corner. Community energy projects mean that when communities invest within their communities, they can get benefits out. So we really should encourage companies to share ownership of the renewable projects that are on the way. And if an example I like to talk about is South Hill, who had a lot of when they were trying to implement the solar panels in their area in Oxfordshire, they came across some backlash with people saying that, or how would it look when we're walking across? And there's this really fun example that you can see on the top left-hand corner, very small people holding up umbrellas. So this was what they did. They decided to all go for a walk, holding up their umbrellas, which was the height of the solar panels. And they were able to prove that there's actually minimal viewing of the solar panels from the main walkways, which is a really fun way that the community can get involved and actually try some of these things out instead of making it a really scary issue and something that's unknown. You know, we can step up and we can challenge big developers to ask them, you know, what can we get out of this renewable energy project? Yes, no trouble. So in today's world of climate crisis, there is an urgent demand for inspiration, leadership, and a tangible reduction of emissions. And this is something that community energy projects exemplify. It's a way for communities to really integrate, to benefit from either financially or from projects that are given to the community to lead themselves and with educational. Next slide, please. So the main things I want to talk about is there are a few things that I think all of us are really keen on moving forward. We all care about protecting future generations. We all care about creating a healthier society. And we all care about restoring our countryside through net biodiversity gains. And I think that the only way we can really do this is with a collaborative approach. So in the discussions that we're about to have, I'd really encourage you to ask those questions, but in a way that how can you get involved and make a positive impact. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to say a few words about how the rest of the evening will run. Then perhaps we'll have a couple of minutes break just so you can stretch your legs a bit or whatever, and then or think of questions, and we will then continue for the rest of our time till 9 o'clock. We're going to have a mixture of questions. Some of them were submitted in advance. You may have seen on the publicity that was put out for this event that there was an opportunity to submit questions in advance. I will start off by putting some of those questions, but there will be a chance for you to comment or ask further questions on related topics and time for us to receive questions from the floor this evening. But so as we can include as much of the topic and as many people's questions as possible, we're not going to ask every single panellist to answer every single question. So I would say to both the panellists and to people in the audience, if you think this question is in your particular area, then please just indicate to me and we can organise that. We want to cover as much ground as we can, so please be as brief as you can, both in asking and in answering questions, and please avoid asking something that we've already covered. So if you've come with a burning question to ask, and somebody else has already asked pretty much the same thing, please do restrain yourselves. And that applies also to questions we've had in advance. So if you're here and you've submitted a question, I'll first of all ask if you want to voice the question yourself. If not, I will. But if you have submitted a question and it doesn't appear, it's probably because we've tried to weave it in with some of the other ones that have been asked. As the practicalities, there will be volunteers who will come to you with a roving microphone. Because we're recording this, and also because there may be people using hearing aids, please do wait until the microphone gets to you before you speak, so that we can all hear. And don't try and take the microphone from the person who's carrying it. They will come and hold it in front of you. So just please allow them to do that job. They will bring the microphone, and once it comes to you, then you can speak. So we'll just take a couple of minutes break. As I say, if you want to stand up and stretch your legs a moment, then we will get on with the questions. Thank you. Thank you, friends. As a question to start us off, is there Philip Skip here? No? Well, I will ask the question that was sent in then. Many consumers of electricity do not understand why renewable energy is costing as much, if not more, than energy produced from fossil fuels. What changes, if any, would the panel like to make to the energy market to rectify this? Oh, yep.
Yeah, deeply annoying, isn't it? Household electricity.
We need the microphone on, please. No.
Yeah, it's
No, he's controlling this microphone.
It is annoying, but
That's not. Use this one.
it's annoying that the microphones don't work. It's annoying that we're paying a cost for electricity which is essentially driven by the price of gas, which, of course, at the moment is driven by the Putin regime's war on the Ukraine. The way that the wholesale electricity market works is extraordinarily complicated, but essentially it means that for most of the time, it's what's called the marginal power station that sets the price, and the marginal power station is usually gas. So every electricity generator gets a price that's determined by the cost of gas, and that means we as consumers pay for electricity as though it is all generated by gas. There are people thinking about how to split the market into essentially a green market and a non-green market. There's some good ideas there. I assure you, it's very complicated and it will take quite a lot of time to happen. The way it will ultimately happen is the way we've basically set out in the PASCO report and in national reports by the Climate Change Committee. That's to generate all our electricity from renewables. When we do that, the cost of electricity will be lower because it will be set by the cost of renewables, which is lower than the cost of gas-fired generation. So that's in the long term, we'll get there. In the short term, it's very annoying.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to another question then. Why should we do something in this country about climate change when others are so bad, like China? Who would like to tackle that one?
Yes, the go-to excuse of everybody who doesn't want to do anything anyway. Just to deal with the China story first, very briefly, any suggestion that China isn't doing anything demonstrates an extraordinarily significant degree of complete ignorance. China is really up against it with 1.3 billion people, still a lot of whom are facing levels of poverty which the country is trying to get out of. But China is actually investing more aggressively in renewable electricity than any other country on Earth. It has the highest percentage of EVs than any other country on Earth. It has some quite ambitious targets for the future. Could they be doing more? Of course. Will it encourage them to do more if we here in the UK say, oh, sorry, we can't be bothered? We thought all this net zero stuff was quite good, but now we've decided it's not really good. Now we're going to squeeze every drop of oil out of the North Sea as the top priority for this country. I mean, the essence of what we do as a small country, small emissions relative to the total global carbon footprint, is partly for real, as in we can make a massive difference to people in this country, and yes, partly symbolic. But I can assure you, if you think what is happening in Africa at the moment, where many of those African countries have never had access to the kind of use of hydrocarbons, oil and gas that we've had, if we in the West start going back on our commitment to phase out those hydrocarbons in Africa, they'll simply say, okay, we get it. You say one thing, you do another. And in that context, it's impossible to get the kind of international solidarity we need.
Shall we take a question from the floor? Oh, you want to say, sorry, can I just add to one, and then we'll come to your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add to Jonathan's points, really good points. With the China issue, we also need to consider 2 points, which is, where do we get a lot of our raw resources from? Often comes from China and other places around the world. So when we do the accounting of how much carbon emissions we actually have, a lot of the things that we use will be allocated to China, which is unfair. And also, if we're talking about the fairness issue as well, it's also important to consider historical emissions. I think the US is the highest historical emitter, with the UK being close second. So it depends how, if you consider, all the industrial revolution that we did as well, all the pillaging of resources, whether that should be considered into that discussion as well.
Thank you. So, can we have a microphone here? Good. Yeah.
Where all this time is the discussion of other possible sources of energy. Hydrogen, which can be made anywhere, it's the cleanest and the greenest of all of them. You can have a solar power station. You can have a solar farm which doesn't use any of the toxic chemicals, inhumanely mined chemicals we have in these in the farms that we have here in Oxfordshire. You can just have parabolic mirrors that focus the sunlight to a point. You can synthesize hydrogen on the site. You can ship it around the world using wind-powered ships. What about carbon capture technology? What about nuclear fusion? It seems to be no discussion of this. It's all just one-sided. A panel, all of people, all who are coming at it with the same viewpoint. And in 25 years' time, one generation's time, there will be millions of solar panels with their unrecyclable components, with toxic cadmium compounds, copper compounds, gallium compounds and lead all being put into landfill where it will get into the groundwater. You know, the more senior members of the panel, sorry if I patronise the younger person, I didn't mean to, but the more senior members of the panel, Jonathon Porritt and the others, know this full well, that it's the worst option of all from an ecological point of view. It's been ripping up ancient hedgerows, destroying wildlife corridors, ripping up trees that support, ancient trees that support many, many hundreds of species of insect. Levelling the land, you have to treat the land surface, get rid of the topsoil so that it doesn't become overgrown. If it gets overgrown, you get saplings growing, it becomes impossible to use in an efficient way. You get dead metal, you get flora and fauna growing everywhere, all on the surface of the solar panels. It cannot be possibly conceptualized as an ecologically friendly way of doing it.
Thank you.
My question is, where is the discussion? It's not really happening.
So the discussion is happening now. So who would like to take that question? I'll take that one.
Yeah, I'll take parts of it. I'll take the parts that deal with different energy sources. And before, I should say at the outset that I've not really worked on renewable energy very much. I've spent most of my career working on energy efficiency, which is a critical part of the energy transition. But my background is in nuclear physics. I worked for the UK Atomic Energy Authority for 12 years. I worked on carbon capture and storage 30 years ago. Yes, people were talking about it 30 years ago. And it's just the situation we're in now is we need technologies that are available now, are cost effective now, and are not going to emit CO2 now. The realistic options are wind and solar. That's not just my view, that's the view of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, representing the scientific communities of the world. It's the view of the Committee on Climate Change. It's the view of the scientists that I know are around energy across the UK and across the world. So, of course, new options may be developed, but to think that nuclear fusion is a realistic option for doing anything by 2035 is sadly not the case. It's just not going to be there. Sorry? Hydrogen will be a key part of the energy transition. It will play a key role in industry, possibly even in aviation, but it is not an energy source. You cannot mine hydrogen. It does not exist in nature. You have to make it, and you need an energy source to make it. And the Sahara Desert is absolutely one option for making hydrogen. I suspect a global market will develop. But if you are suggesting that we should rely on all our energy coming from North Africa, I think you've missed the energy security challenges that the country and that Europe faces.
I think the difficulty about this is the timescales involved. I really do hope that green hydrogen comes to play a very significant part in our total energy economy, as Nick has said, but it's a long way away, and that is because less than 1%, in fact, less than 0.5% of all the hydrogen used in the world today is green hydrogen, which is manufactured using renewable electricity. The rest is either what's called grey, which is using gas in a steam methane reformation point of view, or even a smaller percentage called blue, where you stick carbon capture and storage on a thermal power plant or a manufacturing facility, whatever it might be. It has to be green. The other two are basically a way of perpetuating the use of fossil fuels. And to get anything like the scale of green hydrogen that we need for the future will take time. I want to see that process accelerated dramatically. And interestingly, the country that is doing that now is Australia, as it happens. Just one last point very quickly about the manufacturing of solar panels, which I have considerable concern about as well. And it is perfectly proper to look at the whole life cycle of manufacturing carbon panels and to think about what we need to do on two fronts. Firstly, to insist that solar panels in future will be capable of decommissioning and recycling, and there is a huge amount of work going into ways of mandating total recycling so that we don't end up with the horror story which you, sir, have mapped out there, which is that we end up with a lot of spent panels in landfill sites, which is not a good use of what we should be doing. And secondly, obviously the whole renewable energy story depends on mining a lot of materials. And we need to be far more applied to ensuring that those flows of materials which will be needed come with a lower impact in terms of mining than is currently the case. These are big and legitimate issues to talk about. They are not deal breakers when it comes to solar power being such an important part of the total energy mix for the future. And on the so-called carbon debt for solar panels, which is the length of time it takes to pay off all the carbon that was caused to be emitted in constructing the solar panel. Nick may have the latest figures, but certainly the upper estimate of this is 6 years maximum, and most people are talking about 4 years. 2? Okay, well, we've got a slightly different position here, but let's take anywhere between 2 and 6. So what that means is that after 6 years, it's carbon positive. So some of the claims that are made about never being able to pay off the carbon debt of solar panels are bordering on really dangerously irresponsible, because you do just have to look at what that science says.
Thank you. Can we take a microphone to the gentleman there, please?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure which of the comments we've just listened to address first, but I'll go with the one that's just been said about the use of hydrogen as a fuel. With respect to the panel, go and look at JCB. You know who JCB are. They build yellow diggers. They now have a production line in their factory in Staffordshire producing hydrogen-fueled engines for tractors and diggers. They're already doing it, and if they're doing it, so are many other motor manufacturers. So it's not a long time away, it's happening right now. 2 weeks ago, I was driving down the M1 and I saw a lorry carrying cylinders of hydrogen gas. It's available, it's there to be used, it's being produced. Yes, it requires electricity to produce it. Yes, that's a problem, but it's a clean fuel, it's not like diesel, it's not a fossil fuel. So that's one of the way forwards. So that's first point. Second, the carbon debt point. The next biggest solar farm project in this country at the moment is one called Sonica, based in Cambridgeshire and Suffolk borders. It's about to get a decision from the Secretary of State as to whether or not it can be allowed. The people opposing Sonica commissioned a report from Cranfield University about 2 years ago to look at the very point that's being addressed here. That is, how long will it take for that project to pay off the carbon debt? And that report by academics at a respected engineering university concluded that it would take at least 25 years to pay off the carbon debt because of the involvement of carbon emissions in producing and shipping, transporting, delivering the solar panels that were going to be used. Indeed, because that report also included a review of battery storage, it concluded that unless those batteries never needed replacing in the lifetime of the project, which was something like 40 years, then it would never, ever pay off the carbon debt that was going to be incurred. So please don't try and tell us that it'll take 4 to 6 years. Yes, there are academic studies that say that, but there are plenty of other academic reports that don't.
Thank you. Is there a response to that? Okay.
So we've got contested evidence here, which is not unusual in complex technical issues of this kind. Happily, we can go to the Committee on Climate Change to try and resolve these disputes when they exist between different sources of authority. The Committee on Climate Change has, for better or for worse, come down in the range of between 2 and 6. So I sometimes, not being a scientist or a technologist or an engineer, I feel we have to go with the body of experts that have been set up to advise governments about these things, which is where I would draw my conclusion from. Just very quickly on the hydrogen, yes, hydrogen in fuel cells for some forms of transportation, particularly, in my opinion, heavy goods vehicles, which will be an absolute nightmare if you try and use batteries to provide the energy source for heavy goods vehicles. Total nightmare. By the way, never believe a single word that Elon Musk says about any of this stuff. And he wants everybody to put his batteries in large heavy goods vehicles. Totally agree with you. Hydrogen in fuel cells, particularly if we can get that hydrogen from green sources, that will be fantastic. You quickly skated over the fact that there's less than 0.5% in the world today of green hydrogen. Just a little reminder, in terms of the grey hydrogen that we use, the total global carbon footprint of standard hydrogen used in manufacturing in the chemicals industry today is equivalent in total global emissions to the footprint of aviation. We're talking about 862 million tons of CO2 emitted to produce the hydrogen the world uses today. So the first thing enthusiasts of hydrogen definitely need to join campaigners like me in is saying, let's get the hydrogen industry to clean up its act and decarbonize global hydrogen manufacturing facilities just as fast as we can. And then we would have common ground.
A question right at the back, I think, was the first hand up there, please.
Thank you. There have been examples of communities near clean energy plants around the world getting benefits from those plants. What kind of benefits, either monetary or in other form, do you think communities in the UK should give or should get from planners and developers?
Is that one for you, Skye? I don't know.
This depends on the community. You know, the whole point of this is that the community need to decide. Now, there are a variety of options, of course. There is as you mentioned, the financial side. So this could range from having money off of your energy bills, depending on the project, or it could be, you know, having that funds given into a pot, which then the communities get to decide what they want to do with that. So they could do education, they could do, you know, biodiversity, which I'm really passionate about. I think we should definitely increase that. And it could be, you know, talking about, I mentioned education, it could be for children, it could be for trying to, you know, get policy. It's basically whatever the communities themselves want. That is the main thing I always want to drill into people, is that we need to make sure that the communities who are going to be affected have a say, because these things need to happen. Like, my future looks dire if we don't, you know, use the tools that we have, and we need to make sure that it's done also in a fair way with communities involved. Thanks.
Any more comments?
I would just echo that and say that the answer to some extent is to hold developers of large projects to high standards, you know, both in terms of delivering things like biodiversity and net gain, but also public amenity, community benefit, this kind of idea of having a community benefit pot which can be used at the discretion of the community. There are excellent examples of that around the country which could indeed be emulated, only perhaps at much larger scale, with a much larger community benefit pot at stake.
Any further comments or questions, particularly on the community benefiting? I'll take one from here.
Am I allowed to hold it? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I'm really worried about a debate that's polarised. I mean, every time we switch on our televisions and watch what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, we see the cost of polarised debate. And I think there's very much a polarised debate being set up, this is what I feel today, where what's being said is either you're in favour of enormous solar farms or you're a climate change denier. And I think that is is a great disservice to most of the intelligent and concerned people who live in this area. I was very impressed by Greta Thunberg the other day. I don't know if you saw the story in the paper about how she, and obviously Greta Thunberg's climate change credentials are solid gold. She came out against she was very much against a solar farm that was being constructed or about to be constructed in the Sami area of northern Sweden, and she made the very good point that there is good solar and there's bad solar, and that we shouldn't allow the climate change debate to justify any kind of intervention because the result of climate change is so awful. It doesn't mean you can justify any kind of response to it, I think. And obviously Greta Thunberg agrees with me, or I agree with her. But my question, to get back to the question, in 2003, Barbara Hammond, who's the CEO of the Low Carbon Hub, said, to quote, "We believe that by investing in locally owned renewable energy, we can make a tangible difference in mitigating climate change and empower local communities." So my question is, does the panel agree that the proposals for an enormous scheme, such as Botley West, that's owned by commercial investors and financed by overseas money, are contrary to the Low Carbon Hub's stated principles? And are they exploitative of the communities that are affected by such large-scale developments?
I think, once again, this is perhaps an opportunity to go to the developers and see to what extent, through the consultation process, you can see the scheme modified and to your advantage. There have been examples of large solar farms which have been divided up and small areas of them offered to community energy groups. So it may be possible for you to benefit from their access to low interest, large amounts of finance, but then to see part of the project constructed according to specifications which you may well be able to dictate. I would certainly recommend this kind of thing. I showed you the example of the agrivoltaic deployment, which allows multiple uses of land. This is also an option which some of the large developers are looking at, perhaps experimentally deploying within parts of their projects. Clearly, in order to satisfy bankers and investors and so on, they probably have to use rather conservative technology for part of it, but they will have perhaps that option to flex and experiment with some areas. And I would certainly, again, exhort you to look for community benefit or perhaps community energy ownership of portions of a large project such as this.
Thank you. I think it's a really good question. You would have, I think, noted in my opening comments that I deliberately didn't comment on. I commented on this overall scale of solar development we needed, but not the size of it. So I declare an interest. I am an investor in the Low Carbon Hub. I completely agree with the words quoted from Barbara Hammond, and as she's in the audience, I can say that. I think the position we're in is the one that I mentioned in my talk, in understanding why this application has come forward. It's come forward because people are having difficulties in getting connections for small solar farms, and it looks like there will be less of a problem getting a connection for a large one. I think the reason we're in that position is that we have made in this country a complete pig's ear of putting together energy planning and land use planning. In a rational world, the district councils and the county council would have a plan of where renewable energy is going to be located in this county and in each part of this county over the next few years. We're not in that position, I think largely because the government has been particularly opposed, as we know, to wind energy in England, but that's spilled over into solar energy. So we're not in the position that I would want us to be in of having a rational system to start from. And I think that it will put the district council in a difficult position. I know it's not the ultimate decision maker, but I'm sure it will want to express a view. The question then is, if we're not going to have a few large solar farms, and it means having a lot more smaller ones, when are we going to be able to get those built, and is that going to address the climate crisis? I think there is a genuine dilemma here, and I hope that helps in depolarising this debate, because just to understand the situation that we're in, I think helps people think through where they want, what side they would stand on in the dilemma that you've pointed out.
Thank you. There was. Sorry.
Yeah. So Barbara is in the room, and if you want, if would you be happy to address that? I think it's very directly to Barbara. So let's hear what she has to say.
Thanks, Guy. I thought you were inviting people to come up to me afterwards, not. We have 2 investors in the Low Carbon Hub on the panel, which is great to see. I agree with Nick. I think all of you have been put in a very difficult position because of the way that we do things in this country. And I don't envy any of you making decisions about how to respond to this particular proposal. It landed like an alien spacecraft without even the district council or the county council knowing that it was going to come. We only stand a chance of dealing with that polarisation if those systems are sorted out so that we can have these debates in a good spirit. From the point of view of the Low Carbon Hub, we own a solar ground mount project, Ray Valley Solar, as Skye was saying. So we think that ground mount solar can be done in a really positive way for the community and for the environment. And we want our Ray Valley Solar project to be an exemplar in that respect. It has bifacial panels, as we were seeing in the slides. And one of the reasons why I can't reel off from the top of my head how much community benefit we're going to get from that project yet is because the early results that we're getting from those bifacial panels are hugely ahead of where we thought the model was going to be. So we really need to keep positive and hopeful, I think, about how these projects can happen. We did look at taking a share in a solar farm just outside Ensham. And we took the Ray Valley Solar total ownership instead of that because it proved to be so difficult to structure it. But if there is a way that this solar farm, Botley West, can be produced in a way that we feel is a good way, then the Low Carbon Hub would be more than willing to find a way of structuring that to benefit the local community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Quite a few hands up now. I think we'll take one from the front here next, and then from the back over there.
I have to say, I thought this meeting was going to be about Botley West. With all due respect to the speakers, not one of them really defended the proposal for Botley West. And what I cannot, and I've backed 3 proposals in West Oxfordshire, one at Cholbury, one at Barnard's Gate, one recently that went through Lowlands Subcommittee. I've got no problem with smaller, but this is over 2 million solar panels. That's what you're facing, basically, in the Oxford Greenbelt. Now, can the panel in front of me defend that proposal in Oxford Greenbelt?
Well, just a couple of things. We were not asked to speak specifically to the scheme that has brought everybody here together. So we were all asked to cover different parts of the broader debate about solar, which is what we've done. But I hope we've alluded from time to time to the significance of this scheme. You've asked a very direct question. Can members of this panel support a scheme of this kind? And I can put my hand on my heart and say, from what I've read about it in preparation for this meeting, yes, I could. And the reason for that is very much along the lines of needing both the community approach to this. I am indeed an investor in the Low Carbon Hub. In fact, in a small way, I have supported 15 different community energy projects in this country, and they all mean something to me very significantly. But I would not say that it's either or. I would never say it's either small-scale community and therefore no large solar, and I would never say it's only large solar which will do the job. I think we need both to get us to the point where we have to get to. And I say that discriminatingly, by the way, if I may, couldn't agree more with Greta in terms of her opposition to that particular scheme in the Sami territory in the north of Sweden. Do you know why? It's a wretchedly designed scheme. It is completely insensitive in so many different ways. So please don't think that everybody who's keen on solar puts a tick in every single solar box that comes along under their noses, because it's not like that either. And I think we do have to be very discriminating about all of this. So many people have said it. I guess the really big question is the degree to which local communities around this mega scheme are going to be able to secure the kind of scale of local community benefits that are commensurate with a scheme of this kind. And if you are in a position where you can establish what the scale of community benefit would look like, I don't know why you're laughing about that, it's perfectly possible to make an assessment of what the replicable scale would be for a scheme of this kind. And maybe that would be something that would bring communities together to really increase the negotiating power to get as much as one can through that.
Can I finesse that? Something I hear as part of what you said, which also fits with things we've had in questions submitted. Does anyone on the panel want to tackle the issue of, if we're going to have a big one, why is it here and not somewhere else?
I think that is relatively easy to answer, and it's nothing to do with land use planning and everything to do with electricity network planning. That there is a big major transmission line that runs north to south through Oxfordshire. It used to have a very large coal-fired power station on it called Didcot A. It no longer has a large coal-fired power station on it, and therefore there is space in electricity capacity terms for a big electricity generating station in the middle of Oxfordshire. Now, that absolutely doesn't address the land use planning issues, I know that, but that is the explanation for why it's come forward here. And I think if that helps people understand the context, that's what I was asked to do. I wasn't asked to defend Botley West, I was asked to explain what I thought the context was for the application and for solar in Oxfordshire, and that's what I've tried to do to the best of my ability.
Okay, right, complete sea of hands now. Did you want to say sorry?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. I know that I'm speaking personally now. So when it comes to Botley West, this is a really hard decision because, of course, in an ideal world, I'd much prefer it if we could just have some magical energy source that wouldn't, leave on the landscape, whatever the opposition is. I want to increase biodiversity, and through the research that I've done and the experiences that I've had with other large-scale solar farms, is that you can have an increase in biodiversity, and we need to make that a condition. And the idea that, currently I think it is there's zero community benefit on the Botley West site, and that is disgraceful. And personally, there's so much outrage around this issue. Why can't we put these energies into demanding that there is large-scale community benefit? Put that energy into that, because you can make that's the positive change that you need. Make it a win-win situation for everybody.
Can we take a question about 3 rows back there?
The title of this meeting is Clean Energy, Why Here, Why Now? Well, Jonathon Porritt has dealt with why now, but not why here. The professor has dealt with why here, but not why now. The why now, I think, is probably nobody here in this audience needs persuading as to the reasons why now. You only had to watch Attenborough's program on Sunday night. There's poor turtles, you remember? Well, that is the answer to why now, and we don't really need persuading. But you didn't say anything about other forms of clean energy except solar, with a little bit of a whiff of wind. There was no mention of tidal. Now, tidal is the only reliable form of renewable energy in the world. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, but the tide, up to now, has always worked. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you think about tide. But going back to the subject of this.
Can we take that question, please? And I'll bring in. We've had questions submitted along similar lines, bringing in questions about small modular nuclear reactors and wind and so on. So if.
But I do have a follow-up continuation of the why here, which people haven't always addressed. So could I come back to that, please?
Well, we'll see. We'll take that question.
Well,
for now.
It is quite important, because the subject of this meeting is why here, and that is referring only to Botley West. It can only.
I'm only saying that so we can hear a variety of voices.
Okay.
Thank you. So can we tackle that question about other possible sources?
On tidal, very quickly, I am a huge supporter of tidal power. When I was chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, we wrote a report for the government which advocated for either a large tidal barrage or for tidal lagoons. Unfortunately, the government chose to ignore that, but I'm completely with you that it will be a big part of our future energy mix, because it's just too important to ignore. But it wasn't, sorry, there are so many other things we could have talked about. It just wasn't on the table this evening, that's all.
Just to clarify the point about wind, I think wind will make a low contribution in Oxfordshire because we're an inland county with not a very good wind resource. But I think it will, I agree with Jonathon on tidal, but I think wind will be the biggest source of energy for the UK, both a combination of onshore and offshore wind. But as somebody who was brought up on a hilltop in the north of England, I can tell you there are a lot better places to get wind energy than Oxfordshire. But I think we will probably see 3 times as much wind power as solar power across the country as a whole.
Okay, we'll take a question here. Can you pass the microphone? Can somebody pass the microphone, please?
Due to the unreliability of solar power and then the need for batteries, what would the effect of batteries on the surrounding area and, of course, the mining of lithium be on the environment?
Battery technology. There's quite a lot of said about life cycle impact of the minerals required for battery manufacture and so on. Battery technology seems to be, nevertheless, improving very, very rapidly indeed. New battery chemistries are coming to light. Everybody said we were going to run out of lithium, and the battery industry has largely responded to that by just switching to different metal combinations and so on. So far, I think experience with batteries has been relatively good. They don't make noise. They don't catch fire, despite what people say. Every industry has its accidents, but the battery systems are being manufactured with multiple layers of fire safety built into them. And this is an emerging industry. This is fact, sir. And this is a very important source of energy storage, which seems to be sweeping others before it, but it is not the only source of energy storage. And balancing the electricity system, not just within the country, but between this country and others, through things like large interconnecting electricity cables under the sea, some of which are probably going to be connecting the offshore wind farms in the future, so-called multi-purpose interconnectors across the North Sea. One of the good things that this government has done recently is actually to sign up to a compact on multi-purpose interconnectors. So I think we will see a lot more of these balancing services which deal to some extent with what you were concerned about initially, which is the intermittency or variability of renewable electricity generation.
Just add 2 specific points. One is that the batteries won't necessarily need to be in the same place as the solar farm. So that, and indeed, I think it's quite likely that we'll be able to use the batteries that are going to be in vehicles to balance the electricity grid. If we end up with 20 million electric vehicles, that's a huge amount of battery power sitting there most of the time doing nothing, and I suspect that integration of vehicles into the electricity system will help a lot. As Jonathon said, it's not a complete solution. I was an author on a recent Royal Society report on storage. We expect hydrogen to play a major role in storage in the long term, particularly to balance over longer periods of time than batteries can do. So that's another important potential long-term role for hydrogen. And this can be done to make a wholly renewable grid very reliable costs, with the storage being quite a low fraction of the overall costs.
Thank you. I had a question over there, please.
Hello. I just wanted to first of all say massive congratulations to all the speakers in a potentially difficult environment. I think that I didn't agree with everything they said, but I think they presented really well. So well done. I just particularly wanted to go to Professor Eyre's report, which is my favourite late night reading document these days. I genuinely think you undersold how good that report is. And I think it's important that everybody in the room understands that it is a very well-written report. It is over 100 pages long. But the reason I think you undersold it is that you took the most extreme option, which is Oxfordshire leading the way, and didn't describe the other options. And you pointed out that this solar farm will get us to the 2050 target pretty rapidly. Within that section, you do actually mention in that report that if every house in Oxfordshire had solar panels on their roofs, we'd also hit the same target. And I do think it's important that a balanced picture is provided in these situations, and I really think it is a great report. The final thing I wanted to say, and this is not meant to be rude, and I don't mean to be rude, but I don't think you should make jokes about golf courses and 1% of the land. It might be a tiny part of the land in the country. In my parish in Hamborough, this solar farm will represent 30% of the available green land around the parish. Don't underestimate the impact that will have on people's mental health and amenity.
Thank you for the advice on jokes. My wife often gives me advice on jokes. Sadly, I rarely take it. Just one small point. Investment at the scale of Botley West doesn't deliver the large target for solar that the County Council has got. In 2050, it delivers the 2030 bit of that. So that just as a point of clarification. And yeah, I took a lot of shortcuts in describing the report. Thank you for the glowing review of it. We'll know who to come for when we want reviews of reports in future. But it's difficult to. You'll appreciate it's difficult to summarise in 5 minutes.
Anything about that balance between panels on all roofs of all the houses in Oxfordshire?
Oh, sorry. According to the calculations we did, you can reach the target. The target would be reached with about. I can check this because I've got the detailed notes in front of me, but from memory, it's something like 50% of the solar potential comes from roofs, that's houses, but it's also schools, factories, etc., and 50% from ground-mounted. So, a substantial contribution from both.
Any other comments on panels on roofs and the like? Yep.
I could just say I'm a contributor to the government's solar task force, which is looking at how to get to this 70,000 megawatts by 2035, and the national expectation is more or less in line with what Nick just said. About half of everything is likely to be ground mount. The other half is likely to be divided then between relatively small domestic rooftops and then large commercial and industrial rooftops. But the rooftop solar is particularly held back because of the difficulty of getting a grid connection of adequate size to every building of that type. Which once again comes back to your question of place, sir, which is, I'm afraid some of these projects are naturally attracted to wherever you can get a grid connection of adequate size.
Thank you. There's a question over there.
I just wanted to ask, several times biodiversity has been mentioned. How are you helping biodiversity when you cover 2,000 acres with solar panels? And also, everything to encourage us to be happy about it sees sheep grazing under the panels. One of the most important things we've been told to help reduce carbon emissions is to not eat meat. And many of the young are now vegetarians, and to see vast acreage with sheep feeding there, and where are all the wildflowers? And there are rare flowers in Oxfordshire that I don't understand how biodiversity is going to be helped.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm so pleased to answer a question about agriculture at last. So, no, meat eating and changing diet and so on is certainly part of some of the nudging guidance, at least, that has been coming from the Climate Change Committee. And all I can say really is that farmers are up for this. They will follow market trends in the long term. And yes, indeed, if more people choose a vegetarian or vegan diet, then clearly the agricultural production will it will change in order to meet that shift in demand. But we are a particularly good country, actually, with our relatively moist Atlantic climate for pasture production, which is why we have a lot of dairying and we have a lot of sheep. And we may indeed perhaps choose, our farmers may choose to export and still produce here, even if the national diet itself shifts somewhat. Now, in terms of what I showed earlier, I hope, which is that you really can have multiple benefits deployed within a solar farm, energy production and the management of biodiversity and some kind of agricultural production. There is a growing volume of academic studies, and I have a very good collaborator who's been working with us at the National Farmers Union from Lancaster University, doing a lot of studies looking at not just the scientific measurements of humidity and temperature and light within solar farms, but also then actually monitoring wildlife, everything from insects through to small mammals and so on. And frankly, the lack of disturbance within solar farms has meant that a number of wildlife species have already started to make refuges within them. And the principle of planning development now requiring a certain proportion of measurable biodiversity net gain, this once again is one of the things that through public consultation must be part of good practice in solar farm development. All I can do, frankly, at this point is just assure you that it is possible to manage land within something like a solar farm for biodiversity. It is not the case that the panels are shutting out all light and therefore no grass grows and absolutely nothing lives at all within it.
We had one last question over by the door there, or by the side door.
Hi, so my question is with respect to the albedo. So obviously we're going to be scaling up solar quite substantially to sort of terawatt scales globally. I haven't really heard much discussion about using other technologies like mirrors in conjunction with large-scale solar farms. And I wondered, is that something that is being discussed at higher levels in government? Are we looking at trying to buy ourselves more time with technologies using mirrors to reflect light back and to reduce some of the impact of, I hope that makes sense.
So mirrors.
Are you talking about solar radiation management, sir? Where you have giant mirrors in space?
Not in space, so, actually on farmland. So let's say you've got a solar farm and you've already mentioned bifacial mirrors. You could, on a hot day, flip those and have an array of, mirrors that are pointing that energy straight back up. And at least some of the climate scientists I've been looking at have been saying that that is something that at least should be discussed. And if we're using the amount of land we're talking about, then, is it not an easy thing to consider?
Well, remember the total area of solar farms, we're talking about, 0.1% of national agricultural areas is going to have a really rather small effect on national albedo. At a local level, there are certainly clever things that can be done in order to manage temperatures in buildings. We've seen this with places like Baghdad or African cities where there's a danger of urban heat islands causing completely unlivable temperatures. And the answer there may be just to paint roof surfaces white, which indeed does reflect back some of the heat. But I don't think that's a technique that would have very much relevance here under UK conditions.
Thanks. Yeah, so I echo Jonathan's point that even with the most optimistic projections of solar globally, we're looking at 0.1% of the Earth's surface covered with something that increases the albedo, i.e. the absorptivity of solar radiation. So the overall effect is small. There is one study that shows quite a significant heat island effect from large-scale solar farms. Sadly, its relevance to here is probably a bit limited because it's in Arizona, which literally is a desert. So, it really is about solar farms in a desert. And even there, the daytime temperature increase directly above the panel was about 1 degree. So I think in this climate, with suitable vegetation and water involved, the so-called urban heat island effect of these panels will be quite small. I know people have got serious worries about about the project, but I think that's probably one that you don't need to worry too much about outside even directly above the panels, where obviously nobody's going to live.
Thank you. It's now approaching 9 o'clock, so I'm afraid we're going to have to draw things to a close, and I'm going to hand over to Hilary to close our meeting. Thank you.
So not everyone will know me. I'm Hilary Brown. I'm part of Sustainable Woodstock. And I want to thank you all for coming here tonight. Obviously, we didn't know what the evening would lead to. We invited everyone in the community. We invited as many as we could. And so I thank you all for coming here tonight. But I will just going to use my script a minute, because this is not my day job. I'm a little bit nervous, and I just want to make sure I say all the things that I plan to say. So it's clear from what we've heard tonight, clean energy, which is the subject of this in our area, is not an easy subject for us all. It's rarely black and white, the answers that we hear, and that can be frustrating. The lady in the front here talked about polarised views, and none of us like polarised views, and we do want to get a range of views from you all, which I think we've had from our panellists tonight. So thank you for that. Sorry? Okay. So this was an event for you. So on behalf of Sean and Sustainable Woodstock, thanks for coming out this evening, sending in and asking your questions and making the comments you have this evening. That they were valuable to us. We wanted you to participate as much as possible. We have some really good panellists here tonight, the best we could manage to have here this evening. They've all given their time freely. And I hope you appreciate that they've given the best answers, given the time we've got to discuss this. None of them knew what the questions were going to be beforehand. They knew about the Botley West, obviously, but they had the same flyer that you did. And so it was interesting to hear how they were answering those questions. It's clear, though, that we have the right to say, for those living in surrounding villages in Woodstock, the climate crisis is now directly touching us all living here. We all have the opinion, that's why we're here tonight. In Sean's intro, we knew there was a range of views on climate issues, and transition into clean energy to bring down greenhouse gases quickly. The challenges we know are huge. They are global challenges, as we've heard. And we know there's no single technology that's going to be the perfect solution. We've got ideas to mitigate decline in our climate and nature, but we need to take the opportunities now as well. We need to express our concerns to our politicians. We've heard how the processes in the background are not working as they should. We do need to put pressure on our politicians and our elected officials to really, take the task on this one. So express our concerns to our politicians, to our businesses as well, and our communities. And together we can adapt our own habits, our own personal habits, where we can. Not all of us are able to, but some of us can. We spoke about solar panels on roofs. Maybe some of you can afford to put solar panels on your roof. Maybe you can make the personal difference, I don't know. This large solar proposal came as a surprise to us all. But as generating clean energy is a major part of decarbonising our planet, to keep to the 1.5 degree target, which we've all heard about, should it have been such a surprise? As we've been saying, we've heard for decades, we've known about this for decades. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise that at some point it was going to impact us, and impact it has. So since hearing of the proposal, the words stop and no have been used in Woodstock and the surrounding villages, and sadly by our elected officials too. And yet we know there are 2/3 of adults out there, maybe not in this room, who want to do more action to try and address the global warming that is happening. So will you all please take the chance, grab the chance to be involved in the consultation on Botley West. Everyone asked about community benefits that we've heard about. You know, push on the community benefits for all. Ask about the buffers for wildlife, for managing biodiversity, for managing for wildlife. These are all things that you can influence. The event was planned to offer information. There was no agenda to be pro the Botley West proposal at all, but for our guest speakers to be free to offer their insights, their opinions and knowledge to help answer your questions that you've given them tonight. So I really want to express our thanks to our panel and chair who gave their time freely this evening. We are really grateful for you sharing your thoughts with us and indeed your emotions. Thanks to Reverend Jeremy Old for allowing us to use the church, and the wardens and church volunteers who offered their advice for use in the room and offering the drinks here in aid of their church fund. Please be generous if you can on the way out to help towards their church fund. Is there climate action in Oxfordshire? Sustainable Woodstock is what's known as a community action group. We are all volunteers, and and there is over 100 community action groups in Oxfordshire working across the county to make it fairer, greener and more sustainable place to live, work and visit. There is plenty of action out there if you want to get involved, if those who really want to do some kind of action. Finally, I don't mind saying out loud, I do want to save the planet. And I'm not alone. Unashamedly, it sounds emotional. And given what we know, a range of emotions. Skye said this evening, do we feel despair? Do we feel fear? There's a range of emotions there. So I want you, if you don't have any kind of emotion on this subject, then I really want you, I wonder what's wrong. And I would like you to think a bit more on our choices. So thank you all again, and have a very safe journey home. Thank you. Thank you.